In November of 1841, Cypress Grove Plantation burned to the ground, and beneath its collapsing floors, 13 of South Carolina's most respected men died trapped in a cellar no one was supposed to know existed. By sunrise, the river fog carried the smell of ash and flesh for miles, and the county whispered the same impossible question. How could an enslaved man and a supposedly insane white woman be the only ones to survive? Months earlier, the plantation's owner, Silas Rutledge, had committed an act so shocking that even hardened slaveholders recoiled. He publicly handed full authority over his daughter, Catherine, to an enslaved man named Ezekiel, not as a caretaker, not as a healer, but as her owner in everything but law. Catherine was 28 years old, weighed over 260 pounds, and had spent years drugged into submission by doctors, who called her hysterical and dangerous. Society believed she was broken. What they didn't know was that her body was that way by design, and what terrified people wasn't the arrangement itself, but what followed. Within weeks, Catherine began to change. Her swelling reduced, her tremors stopped, her mind sharpened. She walked again. By autumn, she no longer resembled the woman people had pitied and mocked, and those who saw her eyes said something far worse. Had returned with her health, memory. Then men began disappearing, quietly, one by one. House slaves vanished. Travelers were never seen again. Sounds were heard beneath the plantation at night. Sounds that didn't belong to prayers or business meetings. By the time the fire erupted, rumors were already spreading that something ancient and violent had been exposed. Officially, it was an accident. Officially, Catherine Rutledge died in the blaze, and Ezekiel Cross was sold south. But no bodies were ever confirmed. And years later, bones were found in the swamp behind Cypress Grove, marked in ways no fire could explain. The question that still lingers is not how the plantation burned, but what the enslaved man did to the plantation owner's daughter that gave her the strength to destroy everyone who thought they were untouchable. Spring arrived early in Colleton County in 1841, bringing heat that pressed down like a weight on the lungs and humidity that turned breath into labor. The Combahee River crawled through the low country, its dark water reflecting moss-draped oaks and carrying the rot of wetlands and rice fields that stretched for miles. This was the engine of South Carolina's wealth. Land soaked in water and blood, worked by hundreds of enslaved people who stood knee-deep from dawn until nightfall. Their suffering converted into profit for men who called it order. Cypress Grove Plantation sat at the center of this world. 800 acres of rice land owned by Silas Rutledge, a man wealthy enough to command obedience, but not powerful enough to earn true respect. He owned 58 enslaved people, a number that placed him just below the county's elite, the families whose names opened courtrooms and silenced newspapers. Silas wanted desperately to join them. He had married into respectability in 1812, and when his wife Elizabeth died the following year, giving birth to their daughter, Catherine, he poured his grief into ambition. Catherine grew up isolated in the main house, educated by tutors, shielded from society, yet never protected from what happened beneath it. By the time she reached adulthood, she was rarely seen in public, known only through whispers of her sighs, her violent outbursts, and the heavy doses of laudanum and mercury prescribed to keep her manageable. The county accepted the explanation eagerly. A madwoman was easier than a scandal. Cypress Grove appeared ordinary from the outside, but at night, lights burned when they should not have. Guests arrived without records, and the cellar doors were sealed tighter than any granary. In April of 1841, when Silas Rutledge announced his unprecedented decision regarding his daughter, the county assumed it was desperation. They did not yet understand it was fear. Silas Rutledge was a man shaped by envy and restraint, tall and prematurely gray, his thin frame held upright by pride rather than strength. In public, he was known as disciplined and respectable, a man who kept his word and paid his debts. But beneath that reputation lived an obsession with power and recognition. He believed morality was a tool for controlling the weak, and he proved his loyalty to influential men by doing what others hesitated to do, splitting families, enforcing punishments personally, and never allowing sentiment to interfere with advancement. His daughter, Catherine, was the price he paid for secrecy. Catherine Rutledge had been a perceptive, intelligent child, observant beyond her years, until one night at age 12, when she witnessed something in the cellar that shattered her understanding of the world. From that moment, she was no longer a daughter, but a liability. Her outbursts, terror, and refusal to forget were labeled madness, and her body became the battleground where silence was enforced through drugs, isolation, and humiliation. The weight she carried was not indulgence, but sedation, years of chemical dependence that dulled her mind and trapped her in her own body. Ezekiel Cross arrived at Cypress Grove as a man already broken by loss. 33 years old, tall and quiet, he carried himself with the stillness of someone who had learned patience as a survival skill. His wife and 2 children had been sold south by Silas Rutledge himself, condemned to die on an Alabama plantation, not for profit but as a demonstration of cruelty. Ezekiel remembered every detail of that day, and he remembered Silas's smile. Unlike the others, Ezekiel did not lower his eyes. He listened, observed, and waited. He understood power not as something granted, but as something taken at the moment of greatest certainty. Where Silas saw ownership, Ezekiel saw opportunity, and where Catherine saw the end of her life, Ezekiel saw the beginning of a reckoning. From the moment Ezekiel Cross was placed in charge of Catherine Rutledge, the balance inside Cypress Grove began to shift in ways no one openly acknowledged. Ezekiel removed the medicines slowly, replacing them with herbs and discipline, forcing Catherine's body to endure withdrawal that left her shaking, vomiting, and fevered for days. Silas watched from a distance, uneasy but unwilling to interfere after witnessing results no physician had produced in years. Catherine's mind cleared, and with clarity came memory. She began walking the halls again, then the grounds, her strength returning in measured increments that Ezekiel carefully controlled. What the household did not see were the conversations taking place behind closed doors, whispered exchanges about nights in the cellar, names of men who came and went, and rituals disguised as business gatherings. What they didn't know was that Catherine had kept records for years, fragmented notes hidden in false bookbindings, dates written in codes learned as a child. Ezekiel began mapping the plantation from routines alone, learning when guards were distracted, when wagons arrived unannounced, when Silas left the house after midnight. Every improvement in Catherine's health drew more attention from the county, and every visit from curious neighbors confirmed how dangerous her recovery truly was. Then the disappearances began. A house slave sent to clean the cellar never returned. A drifter seen near the river vanished without trace. No alarms were raised because Cypress Grove was known for discretion. But tension grew as Silas realized his daughter was no longer sedated, no longer obedient, and no longer afraid. Ezekiel and Catherine reached an understanding without ever speaking it aloud. They were not restoring her to survive. They were restoring her to remember, and memory in a place built on secrecy was more dangerous than fire. The truth emerged not as a confession but as confirmation. When Catherine finally described what she saw in the cellar at 12 years old, and Ezekiel realized her madness had always been clarity. Beneath Cypress Grove was not storage, but a ritual chamber used by 13 influential men who called themselves the Brethren of the Harvest. They believed the land required blood to remain fertile, that suffering fed prosperity, and that power was inherited through violence. Catherine watched them bring an enslaved woman to the altar, watched her father stand among them as they cut flesh, collected blood, and consumed pieces of the victim in ceremonial silence. She remembered the smells of iron and smoke, the chanting, the way the men spoke afterward as if they had attended church. When she screamed, they told her she misunderstood. When she resisted forgetting, they drugged her. When she tried to speak, they labeled her insane. Ezekiel learned the ledger existed, a book hidden behind false stone recording every ritual, every victim, every participant by name and date. It was insurance, mutual guilt, binding powerful men together. When they accessed it, the scale of the crimes became undeniable. Dozens of names, enslaved people, poor whites, travelers, marked as offerings. Ezekiel found the entry for his family, reduced to 3 lines documenting their sale and deaths as acceptable losses. Before they could escape with the evidence, Silas returned, revealing he had anticipated Catherine's recovery and Ezekiel's intelligence. The brethren assembled that night, surrounding them in the cellar not as criminals exposed, but as judges offended. Silas offered Ezekiel a choice that revealed the true depth of their evil. Join them, kill for them, become complicit, or die with Catherine and vanish into the swamp like the others. The revelation was complete. There was no justice above them, only silence, fire, or blood. What followed was not justice in any official sense, but consequence in its rawest form. When Ezekiel refused to become what they were, the cellar descended into violence that erased generations of entitlement in minutes. The enslaved people Catherine had quietly warned flooded the chamber as the brethren fell. Men who had never lifted a hand in their lives, suddenly forced to face those they believed beneath them. 13 influential names ended in blood and fear, their power dissolving the moment witnesses refused to look away. By dawn, Cypress Grove was nothing but ash. Its cellar collapsed, its secrets buried under fire and smoke. The ledger that had protected the brethren for decades burned alongside the bodies, leaving no proof for courts that had never intended to listen anyway. Officially, the county mourned a tragic accident. 13 respected men lost in an unfortunate fire, their contributions praised, their crimes erased by silence. Catherine Rutledge was declared dead, her body conveniently unidentifiable, her existence reduced to a sad footnote about madness and fragility. Ezekiel Cross was listed as sold south, another line in a ledger that no longer existed. Unofficially, the consequences traveled faster than records. Enslaved communities whispered about the night the masters burned, about the woman who remembered and the man who refused to kneel. Plantations tightened discipline. Owners slept uneasily. The illusion of invulnerability cracked. Some members of connected societies disappeared quietly, abandoning rituals that suddenly felt less eternal. Power remained, but fear replaced certainty. Cypress Grove ceased to exist not just as land, but as an idea. A reminder that cruelty accumulated interest, and eventually it demanded payment. The brethren of the harvest never met there again, and the silence they relied on became haunted rather than secure. Cypress Grove did not survive the year, but its influence lingered long after the smoke cleared. County records listed the fire as an accident caused by faulty lamps, and the deaths of 13 prominent men were framed as a tragic loss to the region's economy and order. No inquest challenged the official story, no witness was called, and no enslaved voice was ever recorded. Catherine Rutledge was reduced to a line that read, "Deceased, mentally unwell, body unrecovered." Ezekiel Cross was reduced to another line that read, "Sold south, destination unknown." The paperwork closed the case, but it never closed the truth. In the years that followed, land once owned by the brethren of the harvest changed hands repeatedly, never prospering the way it once had. Crops failed, families relocated. Houses stood empty and rotted under the same moss that had watched everything unfold. During the Civil War, soldiers avoided the area, blaming sickness and unease, and after emancipation, formerly enslaved families warned their children not to wander near the old grounds. What remained was not proof, but memory passed carefully, deliberately as protection. Cypress Grove became a lesson rather than a place, a reminder that power maintained through secrecy is fragile, and that silence only works until someone refuses it. Catherine's recovery was never about her body alone, but about reclaiming truth from those who tried to drug it away. Ezekiel's resistance was never about revenge alone, but about choosing not to inherit evil when offered survival in exchange. History often rewards the cruel with monuments and erases the defiant as rumors. Yet even erased stories leave pressure on the ground beneath them. This story asks not who burned the plantation, but who benefited from calling it an accident. It asks how many truths were dismissed as madness, how many ledgers were hidden instead of destroyed. and how often justice arrives disguised as destruction. If this story stayed with you, consider why. And ask yourself what survives longer, power or memory.